Hi, I'm Miko Pellet, and I'm speaking to you once again from Palestine House of Freedom here in Washington, D.C. Violence is not the answer. Violence is not the answer. We hear this quite a lot, and I've heard this recently. But what's interesting is that we always hear this in the context of people who are oppressed responding to violence. And yet, that is when people decide violence is not the answer. When the U.S. attacks God knows how many countries, killing civilians, destroying entire countries, entire cities, we don't really hear that so often. When Israel rains tons of bombs in Palestine, now particularly in Gaza, in the Gaza concentration camp, Israel bombed everywhere from Tunis to Iran. In other words, almost every country in Western Asia and all the way through to North Africa. But somehow when Israel does it, we don't hear this come up. Violence is not the answer only when oppressed people, people of color, come to the conclusion that maybe violence is the answer. So in Palestine, in 1976, Palestinians started to commemorate March 30th as Land Day. It was nonviolent. It was completely peaceful. But the Israeli response has been incredibly violent. People like Iyad Burnat, Isa Amro, Bassem Tamimi, all people who dedicated their lives to nonviolent resistance, have been arrested, have been tortured, members of their families have been killed, and this is a process that has been going on for years and years and years, to the point where now their children are going through the same process, all dedicated to nonviolence, and yet are being killed, are being arrested, are being detained. Hussam Abu Safiya, dying probably of torture in some horrific Israeli jail, in the jails of the apartheid state. In Gaza, Ahmed Abu Artema, who inspired the Gaza March of Return and the entire Gaza March of Return, there was enormous amounts of violence from the apartheid state, from the Israeli military. God knows how many were injured, how many were killed, scores of people. Anas Abu Sroor, Mundar Amira, from Aida camp, all they dedicate their life to is nonviolence and to building a community center in the refugee camp and so forth. Rafat Abu Aish from the Naqab, Palestinians throughout all of Palestine who have been dedicated to nonviolence. Homes demolished, arrested, tortured, killed. But violence is not the answer. The apartheid state of Israel uses two terms that it hasn't invented. These are terms that have been used by colonizers and imperialist powers forever. One is governance. They want governance. It's really a code word, which means to control the other, to control people of color, to control whoever it is that's being oppressed, to control whoever it is they want to kill, dispossess, or from whom they want to steal the resources. The other term is development. And development is known really as gentrification. When people of color, people who are poor, are dispossessed, are kicked out, and new developments, new cities and towns and so forth, or in the case of Palestine, they're called settlements, but they're everywhere, are only provided for Israeli Jews in Palestine or people of privilege here in the United States. But these are terms that are used so effectively that sometimes I think people hear them and they think that governance is a good thing. But development is a good thing. Governance is what we've been seeing in Minnesota. Governance is what we've been seeing with ICE. Governance is what we've been seeing here in the United States, going all the way back to the days of the Black Panthers and the way Black Americans and people of color in America are being treated. Mass incarceration, that's governance. That's what we're talking about. But, of course, violence is not the answer. As though these are not acts of violence. In Western Africa, Ibrahim Traore is creating a coalition, an anti-imperialist coalition. They've been kicking out imperialist powers. They've been using their resources for themselves, and there's a fear. He has to go walk around with armed bodyguards, literally armed like soldiers, because one of his predecessors, Thomas Sankara, was assassinated for trying to do the exact same thing. There's no violence there, except the violence perpetrated against these people. Now we see what is happening in Iran. People are protesting, or at least they began protesting, because of the economic strangulation that they are feeling, that they're sensing. But why is there this economic strangulation? Because of the cruel strangulation that sanctions have made on people in Iran. People, by the way, 80, 90 million people who have done nothing to anyone, who have not posed a threat to anyone. But somehow they are a threat. Cuba is strangulated as well. Why is there such poverty in Cuba? The problem is not the government. The problem is the sanctions. The problem is the violence that's being perpetrated against these countries. Venezuela is being bombed and their president kidnapped along with his wife. But violence is not the answer. Just look at a map of U.S. bases around the world. Who has the right to say that violence is not the answer when you see that map? When you see what the U.S. military and the CIA do throughout the world, and when you see what the Israeli intelligence services and the Israeli military is doing. But who gets to say whether violence is the answer or not? When does it apply? Who does it apply to? I mentioned the Panthers earlier. When the Panthers began arming themselves, that's when Americans started being afraid of the Second Amendment, because that does not apply, of course, to people of color. When George Jackson was assassinated, what did they find in his cell? They found a poem by the Palestinian poet Samih al-Qasim, a poem that has now become very well known, Enemy of the Sun. Why was Chairman Fred Hampton assassinated? Was that not violence? The violence being perpetrated by the colonizers, by the oppressors, by the imperialists, by the capitalists, and the other side has to always hear this mantra: violence is not the answer. And to be honest, the oppressed rarely resort to violence. In the case of Palestine, in the case of people of color in this country, in the United States, the oppressed rarely use violence, rarely resort to violence. Number one, they don't have the resources, but number two, they find other ways, more creative ways, because the violence ends up hurting more people. So is violence the answer, or is it not the answer? If violence is not the answer, then military bases need to be closed. ICE needs to be completely dismantled. The Israeli military needs to be dismantled because it's a terrorist organization. But no, these organizations, these military, racist, violent, brutal organizations are legitimate somehow. The problem is when the other side engages in violence. I spoke recently about this organization called Betar USA, and I mentioned a list of the violent attacks and their violent ideology in Palestine going back more than 100 years. On their website, they have the founder, which is Zev Jabotinsky, and they have an ideology and the practice that we saw over decades of violence, of terrorism. Imagine if there was a website where somebody used, for example, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, here in the United States, and saying we are following his ideology, which was far less violent, not racist at all, than Jabotinsky and Betar. What would happen then? The double standard is so striking, and we can't separate Palestine from Cuba, from Iran, from the reality for Black Americans or people of color in general in America. We cannot separate these because the root problem is the same problem. The root cause of all of this violence is the same cause. And yet, which side keeps saying violence is not the answer, violence is not the answer? Even people who have dedicated their lives, some of the names that I mentioned, and there are many, many others throughout the world, who dedicated their lives to nonviolence, to resisting without violence, are killed by the violence perpetrated by like I said, the United States, Israel, and their allies, their friends. Palestinians are blamed, for example, for October 7th, and people say that the genocide that followed in the Gaza concentration camp is because the Palestinians stood up. Well, Palestinians have been killed in their beds for the last 100 years. They're killed in the marketplaces for the last 100 years. They're killed in coffee shops. Their homes are blown up on top of them. This is a structural problem. The problem is we tend to look at the oppressors, we tend to look at these terms like governance and development and think that these are real. We hear America talk about democracy. We hear America hail people like Thomas Jefferson, who ran basically a slave farm, a slave breeding ground, not far from here in Virginia. And people worship him. People go there as though they're going on some kind of a pilgrimage to Monticello. There's a structural problem and there's a values problem. And unless we take sides, clearly take sides, then on the issue of the values and determine and decide where our values lie, we're not going to be able to solve the structural problem. These two go hand in hand. People have to state their values. They have to stand up for the right values. And then fight the structure. Resist the structure. And we're seeing bits and pieces of it around the world. We're seeing bits and pieces of it now around the United States, in Minnesota, in New York, and so forth. Bitar, by the way, was kicked out of the state of New York. That is the way to go. To stand up, not to focus on the fact that right now we're okay, those of us that are, but look at those that are not. Then look inside ourselves, determine which values we espouse, which values we're made of as humans, as people of conscience, and then act according to those values. That is how we bring about the change. Thank you.